The phone rang at 2:03 in the morning, and in Damien Voss's world, a call at that hour only ever meant one of two things: a body or a betrayal. He was wrong about both. The voice on the other end wasn't a lieutenant reporting a hit gone sideways. It wasn't a rival family declaring war. It was soft, cracked, and trying so hard to sound composed that the effort itself was heartbreaking. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm sorry to call this late. I didn't know who else." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. 22 minutes later, the doors of Boston General's emergency room slid open, and the man half the city was terrified of walked in carrying a bouquet of white peonies wrapped in brown paper, still damp from a florist's cooler that shouldn't have been open at 2 a.m. Nobody in that waiting room could explain what they were looking at. A security guard near the entrance actually reached for his radio, because in 11 years of watching Boston's underworld move through his hospital's doors, he had never once seen a man like Damien Voss carrying anything softer than a folded overcoat. Men like him arrived with lawyers. They arrived with silence. They did not arrive with flowers still beaded with condensation, gripped so tightly in one hand that a single stem had already snapped. By the end of this story, you won't just understand why he was holding them. You'll understand exactly what kind of man spends 5 years building an empire designed to keep one specific person safe from it without ever telling her. That's what he was doing. To understand the flowers, you first have to understand the 5 years that came before them. Boston's financial district is full of buildings that look exactly like what they claim to be. Glass towers, marble lobbies, names etched into brass plaques that mean nothing to anyone who doesn't already know what they hide. One of those buildings, 7 stories of unremarkable granite on the edge of the harbor, housed a company called Ashford Consulting on paper. Ashford Consulting advised small businesses on tax structuring. In practice, it was the financial nervous system of the Voss organization. The place where money earned through channels that would never survive daylight was slowly, patiently taught how to breathe clean air again. Claire Bennett had no idea any of this existed when she walked through its doors for a first interview at 26 years old. She'd graduated from a night program at UMass Boston 3 years earlier while working 2 jobs to support herself. And she'd built a resume out of stubbornness as much as skill. She wasn't looking for excitement. She was looking for a paycheck that didn't bounce and health insurance that actually covered a dentist. The interview lasted 11 minutes. The hiring manager barely looked at her transcript. What he cared about was whether she could reconcile a set of intentionally sloppy books fast enough to prove she wasn't going to waste anyone's time. She finished in 6 minutes and found 2 errors nobody had asked her to find. She got the job. She had no idea she'd just been quietly tested by an organization that vetted its financial staff more carefully than most banks vet their board of directors. For the first 10 days, everything was exactly as boring as she'd hoped. Spreadsheets, client intake forms, a break room with a coffee machine that never worked properly. It was, by every visible measure, the most unremarkable job in the city on day 11. She found the number that didn't belong. It was buried 3 tabs deep in a workbook. Nobody was supposed to look at that. Closely, a routine reconciliation between 2 subsidiary accounts that should have matched to the penny and were instead off by just under $400,000. Most new hires would have assumed it was their own mistake and quietly moved on rather than risk looking incompetent in their second week. Claire did the opposite. She traced it backward, transaction by transaction, for 6 straight hours, skipping lunch, until she found exactly where the discrepancy had entered the system and exactly whose login credentials had touched it last. It belonged to the firm's senior accountant, a man named Walter Griggs, who had worked there for 11 years and was, as far as anyone downstairs knew, simply the man who signed off on the quarterly filings. What Claire didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Walter Griggs wasn't just an accountant. He was the only person besides the owner himself who had full visibility into how the Voss organization moved its money. And he had spent 3 years quietly skimming from accounts he assumed no one would ever audit closely enough to notice. Claire printed the discrepancy. She didn't email it. She didn't mention it to a coworker. She walked it upstairs to an office she'd never been invited into, past an assistant who tried and failed to stop her. and placed the printout directly on the desk of a man she had never met. Damien Voss looked up from whatever he'd been reading, mildly irritated at the interruption, and found a 26-year-old junior accountant standing in front of him with her chin up and her hands perfectly steady. "Who let you in here?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "Nobody," Claire said. "I let myself in. Your accountant has been stealing from you for 3 years. And I thought you'd rather hear about it from someone in the building than from a federal auditor." The room went very quiet. Damien's head of security, standing near the door, actually reached for his weapon out of pure reflex before Damien raised a single hand to stop him. Damien looked at the printout, then he looked at the number circled twice in red pen. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he looked at someone who worked for him and felt something other than calculation. "You found this in 11 days, he said. "My last 3 security audits took a firm I paid $200,000 and found nothing. They were looking for outside theft," Claire said. "You had an inside problem, different math." Damien Voss did not smile easily. People who worked for him for a decade could count the times on one hand. He almost smiled then. "What's your name?" "Claire Bennett." "You just cost Walter Griggs everything he has left, Miss Bennett," Damien said. "I hope you understand what that means in a building like this one." "I understand it means you owe me a raise," Claire said, and walked out before he could respond. She did not, at the time, understand even a fraction of what that building actually was. She assumed Walter Griggs had been embezzling from a legitimate consulting firm and would face a lawsuit, maybe criminal charges. She had no idea that within 72 hours, Walter Griggs would resign abruptly, relocate to Arizona, and never speak to anyone in Boston's financial sector again. An outcome negotiated personally by Damien Voss in a conversation that had nothing to do with lawyers. What Claire understood was simpler. She'd been promoted the following Monday, given a title that didn't exist before her, and told that her new office was 3 floors up, directly outside Damien Voss's own. It would take her almost a year to fully understand what she'd walked into by then. It was far too late to walk back out, not because anyone was holding her there, but because she had already decided, quietly and without fully admitting it to herself, that she didn't want to leave for the next 5 years. Claire Bennett became something that didn't have an official name inside the Voss organization, though everyone who mattered understood exactly what she was. She wasn't a lieutenant. She never carried a weapon, never attended the meetings held in the subterranean rooms beneath the harborfront estate, never asked a single question about where cash arrived from before it reached her desk in need of cleaning. But she was, without exaggeration, the only person Damien Voss trusted with the complete architecture of his empire. Every legitimate holding, every offshore account, every shell company built to disappear the moment it was no longer useful. It all passed through her hands first. She managed his calendar the way a surgeon manages an operating room, with absolute precision and zero tolerance for anything that threatened the outcome. She negotiated multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions with a calm, unshakable authority that regularly left seasoned attorneys twice her age quietly reevaluating their own careers. She flagged discrepancies before they became disasters, closed loopholes before rivals could exploit them, and did all of it while maintaining a professional distance from Damien Voss, so precise, it might as well have been surgical. There was, as far as either of them ever admitted out loud, exactly one rule that governed their relationship. She managed the empire, he fought for it. The two halves never touched. It wasn't that Damien didn't notice her. Anyone who spent more than a week around the two of them noticed the way his attention shifted the moment she entered a room. The way his voice dropped half a register when he spoke directly to her. The way he read every report she handed him once for the content. And once, though he would never have admitted this even under threat, simply because it was in her handwriting. It wasn't that Claire didn't notice him either. She'd cataloged every version of Damien Voss that existed, the cold, unreadable version that negotiated with rival families, the exhausted version that sat behind his desk at 3 a.m. running numbers because sleep felt like a vulnerability he couldn't afford, and the rare, almost unguarded version that surfaced only in the 10 minutes before her workday ended, When he'd linger in her office doorway asking questions about the ledgers that didn't actually require answers. Just an excuse to stay a few minutes longer. Neither of them crossed the line. For 5 years, the wall held, brick by careful brick. Because both of them understood exactly what would happen to the other if it didn't. Damien Voss did not have relationships. He had liabilities and he had assets. And the moment Claire Bennett became the former instead of the latter in the eyes of his enemies, she would become a target in a world that had already proven, over and over, that it did not spare anyone standing too close to him. So they built the wall instead, and for 5 years, it worked. Until the night a black sedan ran her off the road 2 blocks from her own apartment. And every rule either of them had ever followed collapsed in the space of about 9 seconds. Claire had spent that evening exactly where she didn't want to be, a fundraising gala for a hospital wing the Voss Foundation had quietly financed. One of a dozen legitimate philanthropic fronts that kept Damien's public reputation as spotless as his private one was violent. She'd left just after midnight, exhausted. Her heels already off and tossed onto the passenger seat of her car. Replaying the evening's small talk in her head the way she always did after events like that. Cataloging every interaction for information, the way other people replayed embarrassing moments. She noticed the sedan behind her 3 blocks before it mattered. Black, no visible plate lighting, following at a distance too consistent to be a coincidence. 5 years around Damien Voss had taught her more about surveillance patterns than she'd ever wanted to know. And every instinct she'd absorbed by osmosis screamed that something was wrong. She didn't panic. She did the one thing 5 years of training had drilled into her without either of them ever calling it training. She memorized everything she could. The angle of the headlights. The slight rattle in the undercarriage that suggested a fleet vehicle, not a personal one. And, in the half-second before the car surged forward and clipped her rear bumper hard enough to send her spinning off the road into a guardrail. 3 letters from a license plate she caught just before the impact. The next several minutes existed for her only in fragments. The airbag, the smell of burnt rubber, a ringing in her left ear that wouldn't fully fade for 2 days, and underneath all of it, one single, absolute certainty that overrode every instinct toward calling emergency services first. She dialed Damien Voss before she dialed 911. It wasn't fear that made the decision, it was 5 years of completely trusting exactly one person with anything that actually mattered, and in the one moment her life may have depended on it. Her hands didn't even hesitate over which number to call. That single decision would keep Damien awake for the rest of his life, replaying it on nights when sleep refused to come anyway. Because it meant that somewhere beneath 5 years of professional distance and careful, deliberate silence, Claire Bennett had already decided long before that night. Long before either of them admitted anything that he was the person she trusted most in the world. He answered on the first ring. He always did. "Voss," he said, already reaching for his jacket out of pure instinct. The way he did every time the phone rang after midnight. "Mr. Voss." Her voice was thin, threaded with a tremor she was fighting hard to control. "I'm sorry to call this late. I didn't know who else. There was a car. It ran me off the road. I'm at Boston General." Don't move," Damien said. Already halfway to the elevator, his voice dropping into the flat. Lethal calm his men had learned to recognize as the most dangerous version of him. "I'm coming." He didn't call his security detail first. He didn't wake his enforcers in the space of about 4 seconds. Some part of Damien Voss's brain that had spent 15 years methodically calculating risk simply stopped calculating anything at all. He told his driver to take the fastest route, then countermanded himself 2 minutes later and told him to stop instead outside. A 24-hour flower shop he vaguely remembered passing 100 times without ever once considering walking into. He would spend weeks afterward trying to explain to himself why he'd done it, and never fully land on an answer that made logical sense. He only knew that somewhere in the 4-minute detour, some instinct older and less rational than strategy told him that whatever Claire Bennett needed when he walked through those hospital doors, it could not be a man who looked like he'd arrived for a war. The florist, half asleep behind the counter. looked at him the way most people did, with the particular wariness reserved for men whose faces occasionally appeared in newspapers, next to words like alleged and organized. Damien didn't explain himself. He pointed at the only flowers on the shelf that weren't already wilting, paid in cash without waiting for change, and was back in the car within 90 seconds. The waiting room at Boston General at 2 in the morning is its own particular kind of purgatory. Fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. Vending machine coffee, the low murmur of a television bolted to the wall playing infomercials no one is watching. Damien walked through it without slowing down, past a nurse who opened her mouth to recite the family-only policy and closed it again the instant she saw his face. He found Claire in Bay 4, upright on the exam table, a butterfly bandage above her left eyebrow and her right arm, cradled against her ribs where the seatbelt had bruised her on impact. She looked shaken. She also looked unmistakably furious, the particular fury of someone who has just survived something and is already several steps ahead into planning what happens next. She looked up when the curtain moved, and whatever composure she'd been holding together for the police report cracked for exactly 1 second before the professional mask slid back into place. "Mr. Voss," she said, "you didn't have to come." He didn't answer that. He walked to the side of the exam table and, without fully deciding to do it, held out the peonies. Claire stared at them the way she might have stared at an equation that refused to balance. In 5 years, Damien Voss had given her raises, bonuses, a car when hers broke down, and once, memorably, a small fortune in emergency legal fees when a former Ashford Consulting employee tried to blackmail the firm. He had never given her flowers? He had never, as far as she could recall, given anyone flowers. "You brought me flowers," she said slowly. "I didn't know what else to bring," Damien admitted. According to the 3 men closest to him, men who had followed Damien Voss into rooms most people wouldn't walk out of, it was the first time in 11 years anyone had heard him say those 5 words out loud. Not, "I don't know the play." Not, "I don't have the numbers." Simply, nakedly, "I don't know." That sentence is where the story really begins. Because the man everyone in Boston believed incapable of hesitation had just admitted, under fluorescent hospital lighting at 2 in the morning, that he had no idea what to do, and the only reason was sitting 3 feet in front of him with a bandage above her eyebrow, still gripping her own elbow like she was holding herself together by hand. But the flowers weren't the strangest part of that night, not by a long way. The responding officer arrived 12 minutes later, notepad in hand, asking the routine questions every collision report requires. Make and model of the other vehicle? Whether she'd caught the plate? Claire hesitated. It was brief, less than 2 seconds, but Damien caught it the way he caught every hesitation, professional or personal. The same way he'd once caught a $400,000 discrepancy buried 3 tabs deep in a spreadsheet nobody thought anyone would check. "It was a black sedan," Claire said carefully. "I didn't get the plate. It happened too fast." It was a lie. Clean and deliberate, and Damien knew it instantly. Claire Bennett did not forget numbers. She catalogued license plates the way other people hummed songs they couldn't get out of their heads, an old habit from her first year at Ashford Consulting, when Damien himself had half-jokingly told her that a good accountant never lets a number pass by unregistered. If she said she hadn't seen the plate, it meant she had seen something, and had decided, in the disorienting chaos of the minutes after a car crash, that whatever it was could not be repeated in front of a police officer. Damien said nothing while the officer was in the room. He thanked him, signed the necessary forms, and waited until the curtain fell shut behind him before he turned back to Claire with an expression she'd only seen directed at other people, never. "In 5 years at her, what did you actually see, Claire?" She looked down at the peonies now resting across her lap. And for the first time since he'd known her, the steel in her voice cracked audibly. "The plate started with the same 3 letters as the fleet vehicles registered to Holloway Logistics," she said quietly. Damien went very, very still. To understand why that single sentence changed everything, you need to understand what Holloway Logistics actually was and why. Out of every shipping company registered in the state of Massachusetts, Its name was the last one either of them expected to hear that night. Holloway Logistics existed. On every public record anyone could search. As an unremarkable regional freight company operating out of a warehouse district south of the city, it moved furniture. It moved industrial equipment. It filed clean, boring tax returns every single year, the kind that never attract the attention of anyone looking for something more interesting. What almost no one knew, what only 4 people alive were supposed to know, was that 18 months earlier, Damien had quietly begun funneling several dormant accounts through Holloway as a clean pass-through, using its legitimate freight contracts as cover while money that needed to disappear on paper slowly re-emerged somewhere else. Fully legal, fully untraceable, it was by design. One of the most carefully insulated arrangements in his entire operation, precisely because almost nobody knew it existed. Claire was one of the 4 people who did. She managed the reconciliation herself, quarter after quarter. Because Damien trusted no one else with a structure that delicate. Which meant the car that had just run her off the road. Using a vehicle registered to a fleet that officially didn't connect to organized crime in any database a rival family could access. Hadn't been sent by an enemy testing his defenses from the outside. It had been sent by someone already standing on the inside. Damien felt something in his chest go cold in a way it hadn't in years. Not the hot, immediate fury of an outside attack, which he knew exactly how to answer, but the slower, more corrosive dread of realizing that whoever had done this already knew things about his organization that only a handful of people were ever supposed to know. He didn't tell Claire the full weight of what that meant yet. He simply reached out, careful of the IV line taped to the back of her hand, and laced his fingers through hers, a gesture so far outside the boundaries either of them had maintained for 5 years that Claire actually looked down at their joined hands, as if checking whether it was real. "You're not going home tonight," he said. "I have a full calendar in the morning," she replied, out of pure professional reflex. Because 5 years of discipline doesn't switch off just because your ribs ache and your hands are still trembling. "The calendar will survive one delay," Damien said. "You might not survive going home to an apartment someone already knows the address to." She didn't argue after that. By the time the doctors cleared her for discharge, it was nearly 4 in the morning. Damien walked her out through the same sliding doors he'd walked in through 2 hours earlier, carrying her bag in one hand, and quietly redirected the driver not toward her apartment in the South End, but toward the guest wing of his own waterfront estate, a property most of his own lieutenants had never been invited inside. Claire didn't argue about that either. She was too exhausted. And some part of her that she rarely allowed anyone to see simply didn't want to. What neither of them said out loud that night, though both were thinking it, was the same uncomfortable arithmetic. Only 4 people on Earth had full visibility into the Holloway Logistics arrangement: Damien Voss, Claire Bennett, his head of internal security, a controlled, careful man named Marcus Delgado who had been with the organization for 15 years, and his chief financial strategist, a smooth, ambitious man named Peter Reyes who had sat 2 seats down from Damien at every quarterly review for 6 years. By the time Damien got Claire settled into the guest wing, refusing, over her mild protests, to let her carry her own bag up the stairs, the sun still hadn't risen. And he already knew exactly which conversation needed to happen the moment it did. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in a leather chair outside her door until the first gray light crossed the harbor, running through the same 4 names over and over, searching for a version of events where the answer wasn't the one his instincts had already landed on. Before Marcus Delgado ever pulled the Holloway access logs, Damien spent the first several hours after sunrise convinced the answer lay somewhere else entirely, and that mistake very nearly cost him the one lead that would have actually mattered. Boston's underworld, like any ecosystem under pressure, had its usual suspects: the Sheehan family, an old Irish crew that had spent the last 2 years watching Damien's organization slowly absorb territory that used to belong to them. Sat at the top of that list. They had motive. They had a documented history of using deniable contractors for exactly this kind of message-sending violence. And 3 months earlier, one of Damien's men had roughed up a Sheehan associate outside a bar in Dorchester over an unrelated dispute. giving them a fresh grievance that fit the timeline almost too neatly. Damien called an emergency meeting at 7 that morning, before Claire had even woken up in the guest wing upstairs, and put 4 of his most trusted men on nothing but Xi'an surveillance. He wanted addresses. He wanted to know which Xi'an lieutenant had been unaccounted for the night before. He wanted, more than anything, a target he understood, because a rival family was a war he already knew how to fight. It took Carlos Jimenez, one of his younger and sharper lieutenants, less than 2 hours to bring back a problem, the Xi'ans. According to 3 separate sources inside their own organization, hadn't moved a single asset in over a month. Their cash reserves were thin. Their last legitimate shipping front had folded under pressure from Damien's own expansion. And what remained of their operation was, by every metric available, barely capable of running its own payroll, let alone financing a coordinated attack on someone as protected as Claire Bennett. They don't have the capital for something this clean, Carlos reported, standing at the edge of the kitchen counter while Damien paced behind it, his jaw tight enough to ache. A hit and run using a fleet vehicle registered under a shell nobody outside your inner circle knows about isn't a message from a family that's struggling to make rent on a warehouse in Southie. It was Claire, walking down half an hour later with a fresh bandage above her eyebrow and a coffee she wasn't technically supposed to be drinking yet, who put the pieces together before either of the 2 men in the kitchen fully had. "You're looking at this like a territory dispute," she said, easing herself onto a stool with visible effort. "It isn't one. Whoever did this didn't want to scare me off the street. They wanted to scare me off a specific set of numbers. That's not the Xi'an's language. That's someone who thinks in spreadsheets, not headlines." Damien stopped pacing. It was, he would think later, the single moment the entire investigation actually turned, not the access logs, not Marcus Delgado's 4 hours of forensic digging, but Claire Bennett, 3 hours removed from a car accident, correctly identifying the psychological signature of her own attacker before anyone else in the room had considered it. "Fine," Damien said slowly. "Not territory. Not a message about turf." He looked at her. "What does it look like when it's about numbers?" "It looks like Holloway," Claire said quietly. And that was the moment Damien finally called Marcus Delgado off Xi'an surveillance entirely and redirected every resource he had toward the 4 names that actually mattered. By 10 the following morning, Marcus Delgado had pulled every internal access log tied to the Holloway account for the previous 6 months. It took him less than 4 hours to find what he was looking for. And when he laid the printout on the kitchen counter in front of Damien, his expression carried the particular grimness of a man who already knew how badly this conversation was about to go. Peter Reyes had been quietly skimming a small, carefully disguised percentage off every transaction that passed through Holloway for the better part of 8 months. Never enough at any single point to trigger an automatic flag, but consistent enough that, compounded over time, it added up to a number large enough to matter. And 3 weeks earlier, during a routine audit Claire herself had run without knowing whose account she was really examining, she'd flagged an inconsistency so small most people would have dismissed it as a rounding error. Reyes hadn't wanted her dead. That detail would matter more than almost anything else in the hours that followed. He'd wanted her scared enough to stop looking so closely at his numbers, rattled enough by a violent, deniable accident, that she'd quietly back off an audit she didn't even realize was pointed at him. He had badly, catastrophically misjudged both her and the man who had spent 5 years quietly building an empire, specifically shaped around protecting her. When Damien finally laid the full printout in front of Claire that afternoon, she read through it twice before saying a single word, her expression shifting from shock to something colder and more personal. "He used my own audit templates against me," she said finally. And there was something almost more offended in her voice about that detail than about the accident itself, as if the greater crime wasn't the intimidation, but the plagiarism. "He copied my formatting. Despite everything." Damien nearly laughed. It was, he would later admit, only to himself, the exact moment he understood he wasn't simply protective of Claire Bennett. He was in love with the precise Fearless way her mind worked even in the middle of the worst night of her life, and he had been for longer than he was willing to calculate. That night, unable to sleep, Claire found Damien exactly where she expected to, sitting alone in his study on the second floor, a single lamp burning. A folder of Holloway documents spread across the desk in front of him that he wasn't actually reading anymore. He'd been staring at the same page for 20 minutes. She didn't knock. 5 years of walking into that office unannounced had earned her that privilege long before either of them acknowledged what it meant. "You should be resting," Damien said, without looking up. "So should you," Claire said, and sat down across from him anyway, curling into the leather chair with the same careful economy of movement she'd used all day to protect her bruised ribs. "You've been staring at that page since before I came down. What's actually bothering you?" Damien was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't a question he was used to being asked, and it took him longer than he expected to find an honest answer. "Reyes had access to the Holloway account," he said finally. "But he didn't have access to the specific audit schedule that told him you were 3 transactions away from finding him. That schedule existed in exactly 2 places. Your files and mine." Claire went very still. "You think someone else is involved?" "I think," Damien said slowly, "that somebody told Peter Reyes exactly when to panic. And I intend to find out who, once this is finished tonight. I don't want to think about it. Tonight, I just want to sit here and not be the version of me that has to." It was, without either of them naming it directly, the most honest thing Damien Voss had said to anyone in over a decade. Claire didn't push further. She simply reached across the desk, closed the folder in front of him, and set it aside. "Then don't," she said. "Not tonight." They sat in that quiet study for the better part of an hour, saying almost nothing. The wall between them thinner than it had been in 5 years, and neither one quite ready to be the first to knock the rest of it down. When Claire finally stood to head back upstairs, Damien caught her hand, briefly, wordlessly, and let it go again before either of them had to decide what it meant. Neither of them mentioned the loose thread again for 3 weeks. But it never stopped sitting quietly in the back of Damien's mind. The uncomfortable, unresolved arithmetic of a 5th name that had to exist somewhere. A person who had known enough to warn Peter Reyes exactly when the walls were closing in, and who was, as far as either of them could prove, still out there. Damien didn't move on Peter Reyes that same night, though every instinct he had screamed at him to. 15 years of running an organization had taught him a harder lesson than rage ever could. That a man who moves before he has every threat accounted for is a man who ends up fighting the wrong war. So instead of driving straight to Reyes's Beacon Hill townhouse and settling things the way the old version of Damien Voss would have, he spent the following day letting Marcus Delgado quietly build a complete picture. Every altered transaction, every access log, every late-night login that placed Reyes inside the Holloway files exactly when the numbers started bending. By 6 the following evening, the picture was airtight. Damien called Reyes into his office under the pretense of a routine quarterly review. The same kind of meeting the two men had sat through 100 times before without incident. Reyes walked in wearing the same easy, confident smile he'd worn at every review for 6 years. It lasted exactly as long as it took him to see Claire seated in the corner chair, her tablet open on her lap, and the printed access logs already waiting on Damien's desk. "We can do this quietly," Damien said, before Reyes had fully closed the door behind him. His voice was flat, almost conversational, which was somehow worse than shouting would have been. "Or we can do this the way you tried to do it to her." "Your choice." Reyes's composure cracked in stages, first confusion, then calculation, then, when he understood there was no version of the conversation where he talked his way out, something closer to resignation. He didn't deny the numbers. Men who'd worked around Damien Voss long enough knew better than to insult him with a lie that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of scrutiny. "I never wanted her hurt," Reyes said, and for a moment there was something almost pleading in it. "I needed her to stop looking. She was 3 transactions away from the whole thing. I panicked." "You had a man run a car off the road at 40 miles an hour," Claire said quietly from the corner, not looking up from her tablet. "There is no version of that plan where I don't get hurt, Peter." You just didn't care which kind of hurt it turned out to be. Damien said nothing for a long moment, watching Reyes absorb the fact that the woman he'd tried to intimidate into silence had just dismantled his last remaining excuse in 11 words. What happened to Peter Reyes over the following 72 hours is not something either of them ever discussed in detail again. Not even years later. What is known because Claire herself confirmed the outline much later, and because public records eventually caught up to the rest, is that Holloway Logistics quietly dissolved within the month. Its assets were folded into 3 entirely new shell structures Claire herself designed from scratch. Structures so clean that not even Reyes's former associates could trace where the money had gone. Peter Reyes's name never appeared on another payroll in Boston's financial sector again. He relocated, quietly and permanently, to a city Damien never mentioned by name in front of Claire. And the 2 men who escorted him there were never asked by anyone who valued their own safety what exactly the conversation on the way had covered. Damien didn't personally explain any of it to Claire. He didn't need to. 5 years of reading his silences had taught her exactly which questions to leave unasked. And this, both of them silently agreed, was one of them. What she did ask, 3 days later. Sitting across from him at the kitchen counter of the waterfront house she still hadn't officially left, was a much smaller question with a much larger answer hiding inside it. "Why flowers?" she said. "Out of everything you could have done that night, why did you stop for flowers?" Damien considered the question longer than she expected. "Because I've spent 5 years being the only person who knows exactly what to do in every emergency this organization produces," he said finally. "And the second I heard your voice on that phone, for the first time since I was 22 years old, I had absolutely no idea what to do. Buying flowers was the only decision that felt like it belonged to a version of me that wasn't calculating anything at all." Claire didn't say anything for a long moment, then, very quietly, she reached across the counter and took his hand, not out of fear, not out of shock, but simply because 5 years of distance had finally run out of reasons to continue. The 3 weeks between Peter Reyes's disappearance from Boston and Claire's final scan were, by every account from the people who worked closest to both of them, the strangest stretch either the Voss organization or Claire Bennett had ever experienced. Claire refused to fully step back from her responsibilities, despite Damien's repeated, increasingly creative attempts to convince her otherwise. She ran the quarterly reconciliation from a laptop propped on a pillow in the guest wing before her ribs had even finished healing. Dictated instructions to Marcus Delgado over the phone while still wearing a sling. And flatly rejected every suggestion that she take an actual vacation. Informing Damien on more than one occasion that the empire did not, in fact, run itself just because she'd been temporarily inconvenienced by a criminal. What did change, quietly, and almost without either of them announcing it, was the architecture of their days. Damien began arriving at her office in the mornings not with a folder of urgent business, but with coffee made exactly the way she took it, a detail he'd apparently absorbed without either of them ever discussing it directly. He started staying past the hour their conversations were supposed to end, inventing reasons to remain in the room a few minutes longer. The same habit Claire had noticed in him years earlier but had never let herself name out loud. The men who worked around them noticed too. Carlos Jimenez mentioned to Marcus Delgado, in a tone somewhere between amused and cautious, that he'd never seen Damien Voss laugh at anything before the week. Claire started teasing him about his handwriting on internal memos. Marcus, who had been with the organization the longest and understood better than anyone what kind of walls Damien had built around himself over the years, simply said it was about time somebody found a way past them. For Claire, the shift was quieter but no less significant. She found herself, for the first time in 5 years, no longer cataloging every interaction with Damien for professional distance, but simply existing in his presence without the constant internal audit she'd maintained since her 2nd year at the firm. She caught herself more than once, choosing to linger in a doorway a few extra seconds the same way he did, and pretending, unconvincingly, that it was only about the work. Neither of them said the word that both of them were clearly circling. Not during the long nights reviewing the new shell structures Claire had designed to replace Holloway. Not during the quiet dinners that had somehow, without either of them formally arranging it, become a nightly occurrence at the waterfront house instead of an occasional necessity. The wall between the ledgers and the danger, between the glass office and the empire, had already cracked the night the phone rang at 2 a.m. What remained now was simply the question of which one of them would be brave enough to finish knocking it down. The story doesn't end with a dissolved shell company or a man who quietly vanished from the city. It ends 3 weeks later, in the same hospital lobby where all of it began. Because Claire had insisted on returning for a final scan to confirm the concussion had fully cleared. Damien was waiting for her when she came out, holding a second bouquet of peonies. And this time there was no emergency behind it. No bruise on her cheekbone, no fear pulling the air in the room tight. "You already brought me flowers once," Claire said, eyeing the bouquet with the same instinctive suspicion she gave any number that didn't immediately balance. That time. "I didn't know what else to do," Damien said. "This time, I know exactly what I'm doing." It wasn't a grand declaration built for a movie screen. It wasn't the kind of moment scripted for maximum drama. But for two people who had spent 5 years keeping a careful, deliberate wall between the ledgers and the danger, between the glass office upstairs and the empire that funded it, it was the first time either of them let that wall come down in daylight. In public, where absolutely anyone could see it happen. She took the flowers. She didn't ask him to explain himself further. Because for the first time in 5 years, she didn't need an explanation, she simply understood. They stood there for a long moment in the hospital lobby. The same lobby where a security guard had once reached for his radio at the sight of a man like Damien Voss carrying something as soft as flowers. And neither of them moved to leave right away. Claire finally broke the silence, glancing down at the bouquet and then back up at him with the same dry, unimpressed expression she gave every report that didn't quite meet her standards. "You know," she said, "for a man who runs half the financial infrastructure of this city out of his head, you really do only know one flower." "Peonies," Damien said, "are the only thing that felt like it belonged to you the first time I bought them. I didn't see a reason to change my methodology." "That's the most accountant thing you've ever said to me. 5 years around you," Damien said. Some of it was bound to rub off. It wasn't a grand declaration built for a movie screen. It wasn't the kind of moment scripted for maximum drama. But for two people who had spent 5 years keeping a careful, deliberate wall between the ledgers and the danger, between the glass office upstairs and the empire that funded it, it was the first time either of them let that wall come down in daylight, in public, where absolutely anyone could see it happen, outside. The city moved the way it always did, cabs idling at the curb, the harbor wind cutting through the entrance doors every time they slid open. An ordinary Tuesday afternoon, completely unaware that it had just witnessed the quiet ending of a 5-year siege neither combatant had ever admitted to fighting. Damien offered his arm, an old-fashioned gesture that felt strange coming from a man who'd once put 3 rounds through a locking mechanism without blinking. And Claire, after a beat of mock consideration, took it. They walked out together, the second bouquet of peonies held loosely between them. And for the first time since the phone had rung at 2:03 in the morning, Damien Voss didn't carry the weight of an empire built to survive alone. He carried something that finally, unmistakably, felt lighter, and he had absolutely no intention of setting it back down. Somewhere in the organization's records, buried in an old access log nobody had thought to cross-reference against the Holloway account, there was still a fifth name Damien hadn't found yet, someone who had known enough, 3 weeks before the car ever hit Claire's bumper, to warn Peter Reyes that his time was running out. Damien hadn't forgotten it, he'd simply decided, for the first time in 15 years, that the empire could wait one more day while he figured out exactly what he was fighting for before he went back to fighting for it. If a 2 a.m. phone call and a bouquet of peonies can crack open a 5-year wall between a mafia boss and the woman who quietly runs his empire, imagine what happens when the danger isn't fully over yet, because Peter Reyes wasn't the only person who knew about Holloway logistics before that night. If this story pulled you in, tell me in the comments what you think happens when Damien finally finds out exactly who tipped Reyes off in the first place. And if you want to see exactly how far Claire and Damien's story goes from here, make sure you're subscribed, because this is only the beginning of their reign.